On a crisp spring morning, as the world watched the smiling Princess of Wales depart a charity event, a lone figure in the crowd saw not a royal spectacle, but a target. What happened next, a blur of motion, a shouted warning, a guard's instinctual lunge, would last only seconds but echo for years. This is not just a story of a threat stopped, but of the fragile line between safety and chaos, of the ordinary man who stood upon it, and the hidden reverberations that would touch the lives of the royal family, the protector, and even the would-be assailant in ways no one could have predicted. The morning of April 4th was deceptively ordinary at St. Luke's Community Hall in West London. A clear sky held a pale sun, and a light breeze carried the scent of blooming hyacinths from a nearby park. Outside the hall's freshly painted doors, a crowd of about 300 had gathered, a mix of well-wishers, charity volunteers, and the ever-present press pool with their silent, clicking cameras. The mood was cheerful, anticipatory. They were all waiting for Catherine, Princess of Wales, and her daughter, 8-year-old Princess Charlotte. The visit was a brief stop on a wider tour, a chance to highlight a local initiative supporting children's arts. For the crowd, it was a glimpse of royalty, a photo opportunity, a story to tell. Among them, blending into the structured security perimeter, was Sergeant Mark Thorne. At 42, Thorne was a 15-year veteran of the Royalty and Specialist Protection Command. His physique was solid, not bulky, encased in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that hid his communications earpiece and the discreet weight of his sidearm. His eyes, a calm gray, continuously scanned the environment not as a tourist would, but as a tactician. He noted the position of every uniformed police officer, the edges of the press pen, the windows of the buildings opposite, the rhythm of the crowd's murmuring. He had done this hundreds of times. Procedure was a rhythm in his blood. Arrival, sweep, establish positions, monitor the principal's approach, the departure, the wave, the movement back to the vehicles. He respected the routine, but never trusted it. His training screamed that threat always came when routine bred complacency. Inside her armored Range Rover, Princess Charlotte, dressed in a cheerful blue coat and tights, chatted excitedly with her mother about the paintings she might see. Catherine smoothed her daughter's hair, offering a warm, reassuring smile that belied her own acute awareness of the world outside the tinted glass. She too had undergone rigorous security briefings. She knew the dance, the importance of the wave, the steady pace, the unseen shield that men like Thorne provided. Her role was to be visible, engaged, and normal, to project calm so that her children could experience slivers of ordinary life. The vehicles arrived. The door opened. The public cheer rose in pitch. Catherine emerged first, offering that famous, warm smile, turning to help Charlotte down. The little princess, momentarily shy, clutched her mother's hand, then, remembering her training, gave a small, perfect wave that elicited a chorus of ahs from the crowd. The pair began their walk, a slow, gracious procession along the designated barrier, pausing to accept a small bouquet, to exchange a few words with a waiting organizer. Thorne's position was 5 meters to their rear and flank, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the first 3 rows of the crowd. He registered the smiles, the waving flags, the outstretched phones. Then, a flicker. A man, late 30s, in a nondescript gray jacket, standing unusually still amidst the waving, jostling crowd. He wasn't smiling. His hands were deep in his pockets. His eyes were not on the Princess of Wales, but, locked, with an unsettling intensity, on Princess Charlotte. Thorne's internal alarm, a silent, cold siren, began to blare. He keyed his mic, his voice low and calm. Standby, possible anomaly. Civilian male, gray jacket, north side barrier, 7 meters from principal juvenile. Eyes fixed. The acknowledgement crackled softly in his ear. He began to move, not rushing, but, with deliberate purpose, closing the distance, his angle shifting to get a clearer view of the man's hands still buried in his pockets. The protocol was a ladder: identify, assess, intervene, isolate. He was on the second rung, his heart rate steady but his senses hyper-alert. The man's expression wasn't one of joy or curiosity. It was a blank mask, a terrifying void where human reaction should be. The cheerful noise of the crowd seemed to dampen, funneling into a tunnel of perception where Thorne saw only the man, the princess, and the space between them. The walk continued for another few steps. Catherine stooped to point something out to Charlotte. The little princess laughed, a bright, clear sound. In that exact moment, The man in the gray jacket moved. It wasn't a run, not a lunge. It was a sudden, decisive step forward, his right hand pulling free from his pocket. The sun glinted not on metal, but on the hard, clear plastic of a large, industrial-sized spray bottle, the kind used for gardening or cleaning. His thumb found the trigger, and he raised it, arm extending, not towards Catherine, but directly at Charlotte's face. A shout, incoherent, raw, tore from his throat. Later, reports would argue over whether it was a political slogan, a personal grievance, or just a wordless scream. For Thorne, in that nanosecond, the content was irrelevant. The intent was clear. There was no time for the next rung of the protocol. Assessment became action. Thorne exploded forward. 8,000 hours of training took over. He didn't tackle the man. He used a body intercept technique, driving his shoulder into the man's extended arm, knocking it skyward just as a jet of clear liquid shot from the nozzle. It misted harmlessly into the air above the crowd. Thorne's momentum carried them both to the ground. A controlled crash, his weight pinning the man, his own hand now on his weapon, his voice a sharp, commanding bark. Stay down. Do not move. The scene, which had been a tableau of royal gentility, erupted into a whirlwind of sudden, shocking movement. The cheerful crowd sounds fractured into screams and gasps. In the same moment Thorne moved, Catherine's instincts, sharper than any protocol, flared. She didn't look to see the threat. She simply spun, using her own body as a shield, wrapping Charlotte completely in her arms and dropping to a crouch, turning her back to the commotion, a living fortress for her child. Other security officers swarmed, forming a protective wall around them, their faces stern, their movements swift and practiced. The sunny spring day had shattered. The ordinary visit was over on the damp pavement. A fierce, silent struggle ensued for mere seconds before the man in the gray jacket, whose name would soon be known as David Rigby, went limp beneath Thorne's restraint. Not from injury, but from a sudden, total depletion of will. The fight left him like air from a punctured balloon. As Thorne maintained his hold, his knee in Rigby's back, his eyes scanned the liquid on the ground. It smelled sharply chemical, not like paint or dye, but something acrid and unfamiliar. His mind raced through threat matrices. Acid, bleach, a noxious chemical agent. Chemical hazard. Stand clear, he shouted, and the cordon widened. Rigby offered no resistance as he was cuffed, his face pressed against the cold ground, his eyes empty and fixed on the distant curb. Chaos, however, is a tide that recedes into a terrifying, orderly silence. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the procedural tsunami was just beginning. The royal party was extracted with breathtaking efficiency. One moment Catherine and Charlotte were a huddled, protected cluster. The next, they were gone, ushered into the armored vehicle which sped away, its destination altered, its schedule obliterated. On the scene, a senior officer took charge. Rigby was hauled to his feet, silent and unresisting, and led to a waiting police van. The area around the spray was sealed with forensic tents. Witnesses were corralled, their phones temporarily collected under anti-terrorism protocols. The cheerful community hall entrance now looked like a crime scene, which it was. For Mark Thorne, the adrenaline did not subside, it mutated. A cold, clinical focus settled over him. He gave his initial statement to a senior officer on the spot, his words precise, unemotional, the observation, the movement, the intervention. He noted the time, the angle, the description of the bottle. Inside, a tremor was beginning, a delayed shockwave, but he compartmentalized it. His job now was to be a perfect witness, a component of the machine. He was driven not home, but to a secure briefing room at Scotland Yard. There, in a stark, windowless space, he recounted everything again, this time for the counter-terrorism detectives. He sipped water from a paper cup, his hands steady, while his mind replayed the loop, the blank face, the glint of plastic, the arc of the liquid, Charlotte's laugh cutting off. He pushed the image of the child away. Focus on the facts. The facts, as they began to emerge about David Rigby, painted a confusing, tragic picture. He was not on any watch list. He was a 38-year-old library assistant from Coventry, recently made redundant. He lived alone, had no history of violence or political activism. His neighbors described him as quiet, withdrawn since losing his job, a man who kept to himself. His digital footprint revealed a deep, recent descent into obscure online conspiracy forums, ones that spun elaborate, hateful fantasies about the royal family being imposters, or part of a global cabal. In his flat, police found notebooks filled with incoherent ramblings linking royal public appearances to secret signals. The spray bottle contained a concentrated mixture of household bleach and vinegar, a potentially dangerous chloramine gas if inhaled deeply, capable of causing severe respiratory distress and burning to the eyes and skin. It was not a weapon designed to kill, but to maim, to terrorize, to unmask what he believed was an illusion. He had driven to London that morning, a solitary figure on a mission born of madness and despair. Back at Kensington Palace, in a private sitting room, the human impact was being measured in quiet tones and fierce embraces. Charlotte, confused and frightened by the sudden violence and the rush to safety, was comforted by her mother and a trusted nanny. Catherine, her own heart hammering, maintained a preternatural calm for her daughter, her smile gentle but her mind working with ferocious clarity. She would later debrief thoroughly with the security team, her questions insightful, practical. Prince William, arriving from a separate engagement, his face a mask of controlled fury and concern, gathered his family close. The sanctity of their public life had been violently breached, and the primary target had been their young daughter. The psychological calculus for the parents was immediate and harrowing. How to explain this to a child, how to rebuild her sense of security, how to balance their duty to be visible with the primal need to hide their young away. The palace's public statement, issued that evening, was brief and dignified, thanking the police and security services for their swift action, confirming the family was safe, and requesting privacy. Behind the scenes, a profound and personal shock was reverberating through the household's private quarters. Meanwhile, the news cycle erupted. The initial, shocking reports, attack on Princess Charlotte thwarted, flashed around the globe. The video, captured on a dozen phones from a distance, was grainy but clear. The peaceful scene, the sudden movement, the guard's swift tackle, the protective huddle around the princess. Thorne's name was not yet public, but his action was already being hailed as heroic, lightning fast. In the public eye, he was an anonymous guardian angel. In the quiet of his own home later that night, having been finally released from debriefings, Mark Thorne sat at his kitchen table, the silence ringing in his ears. He replayed his actions. Had he been fast enough? The liquid had been airborne. Had any droplets reached the princess? Had his assessment been correct? What if it had been a gun? What if there had been a second attacker? The what-ifs swarmed, the professional's curse. He thought of his own teenage daughters, asleep upstairs, safe because of the locked door and the quiet suburb. He thought of a little girl in a blue coat, whose ordinary day had turned into a nightmare he had only partly stopped. He did not feel like a hero. He felt the crushing weight of the line he walked, a line that had suddenly felt razor thin. He stared at his hands, which had finally begun to shake. The days that followed were a blur of procedure and quiet anxiety. David Rigby was formally charged with attempted grievous bodily harm, possession of a noxious substance with intent to cause harm, and a public order offense. He was remanded into custody for a psychiatric evaluation. The tabloids, having dubbed him the would-be royal assailant, splashed his life across their front pages, dissecting his loneliness, his job loss, his descent into the digital rabbit hole. The narrative publicly was one of a lone, disturbed individual, not a coordinated plot. This brought a measure of political relief, but little personal comfort to the palace. For the Wales family, the incident necessitated an immediate and thorough review of security protocols. Meetings were long and somber. The questions were relentless. Could the threat have been identified earlier in the crowd? Were the perimeter distances sufficient? The use of a common household item as a weapon presented a horrifying new challenge. How do you screen for a bottle of bleach? Catherine and William were deeply involved, their perspective as parents paramount. They insisted that any changes must balance absolute safety with the need for their children to not grow up in a state of perpetual, visible siege. The decision was made to increase the buffer zone during walkabouts and to implement more advanced, discrete crowd scanning technology. But they also agreed, after careful discussion with child psychologists, that Charlotte should return to public life in a carefully managed way, lest fear become her defining memory. A low-key family visit to a trusted organization was quietly scheduled for 2 weeks later. For Mark Thorne, the return to duty was not immediate. He was placed on a mandatory, short administrative leave, standard procedure after a major incident. He was also assigned a welfare officer. He spent the first day at home, trying to fix a leaky tap, his mind miles away. The second day, he went for a long, punishing run. The physical exertion helped quiet the mental noise. He met with the welfare officer, a former colleague, and spoke in clipped, professional terms about the incident. He did not mention the dreams, the sudden jolts of awareness when his own children moved too quickly in his peripheral vision. He was a professional. He processed things professionally. Or so he told himself. The palace, through private channels, sent a handwritten note from the Prince and Princess of Wales. It was brief, heartfelt, and deeply personal. It thanked him not in formal, official language, but as parents thanking the man who protected their child. It mentioned his courage and instinct, words that struck Thorne more deeply than any official commendation could. He read it several times, then placed it in a drawer, the weight of its gratitude both an honor and a new kind of pressure. The controlled return of Princess Charlotte to a public event was a meticulously planned operation. It was a small, invitation-only garden party at a children's hospice with which the family had long ties. The security presence was heavier, but more discreet. Thorne was there, part of the team, back in his dark suit. When the car doors opened and Catherine stepped out, followed by a cautiously smiling Charlotte, Thorne felt a tightness in his chest. The little princess looked older, her eyes slightly more watchful. She held her mother's hand tightly. As they walked, she glanced once, briefly, towards the security line. Her eyes passed over Thorne, a uniformed figure among others. There was no recognition, nor should there be. But, in that glance, Thorne saw not fear, but a quiet resilience. She was there, facing the world again. His job, in that moment, felt clarified. It wasn't just about stopping threats. It was about enabling that resilience, protecting the possibility of that smile. The investigation into Rigby continued, building a case for the Crown Prosecution Service. The psychiatric reports began to outline a man who had suffered a profound break from reality, his mind poisoned by isolation and conspiracy theories. He was a danger, but a pathetic one, a symptom of a wider societal sickness. Thorne, in his final official debrief, was asked if he felt any animosity toward Rigby. He thought carefully. He's a man who needed help long before he picked up that bottle. Thorne said finally. My job was to stop the action, not judge the man. That's for the courts. It was a detached, textbook answer, one that masked the complex knot of anger, pity, and professional disdain he actually felt. A week later, Thorne was back on a full rotation. The incident at St. Luke's Hall began its slow shift from a present trauma to a past event, a case study that would be analyzed in future training exercises. For the public, the story faded, replaced by new headlines. But, in the lives it had touched, the echoes were permanent. The palace walls felt both more secure and more like a cage. Mark Thorne's vigilance, always sharp, now had a specific, haunting face attached to it. And David Rigby sat in a cell, awaiting his fate, a man who had sought significance in a violent act and found only oblivion and disgrace. The threads of their lives, violently knotted together on a spring day, were now unraveling on separate, lonely paths. The quiet aftermath was, in many ways, more demanding than the explosive event itself. For Sergeant Mark Thorne, reintegrating into the daily rhythm of protection duties required a conscious recalibration. The memory of the gray jacket, the spray bottle, the arc of liquid, was now a permanent file in his mental archive, to be referenced but not obsessed over. He found himself studying crowds with an even finer grain, his eyes lingering on hands, on expressions that seemed too blank or too intense. His colleagues treated him with a subtle, respectful deference that he disliked. He wasn't a hero to them. He was a guy who'd done his job under pressure, and now they all had to live with the raised benchmark. At home, the strain manifested in small, almost invisible ways. He became hyper-aware of exits in restaurants, of people loitering near his daughter's school. He started a rigorous new fitness regimen, pushing his body as if trying to outrun the reflexive tremor that still occasionally visited his hands late at night. He spoke about it with his wife, Laura, in fragments during late-night talks in their kitchen. She, a nurse, understood trauma but worried about his compartmentalization. You stopped him, Mark. She's safe. You have to let some of it go, she'd say, holding his hand. He would nod, agreeing. But the letting go was a process with no clear manual. The palace, meanwhile, was navigating its own new normal. For Princess Charlotte, the garden party had been a success, but it was followed by careful, child-focused debriefs with a psychologist specially vetted by her parents. They used drawings and play to let her express the confusion and fear. She asked questions that were heartbreaking in their simplicity. Why did that man not like me? And will Daddy's policeman always stop the bad people? Catherine and William answered with honest reassurance, shielding her from the darker complexities. They made a conscious effort to fill her world with familiar, joyful routines, writing lessons, playdates with trusted friends, baking with her mother. The shadow of the event was acknowledged, but not allowed to dominate the light of her childhood. Professionally, the security team's relationship with the principals deepened. The shared experience of the incident created an unspoken bond of trust. William, in particular, made a point of engaging more personally with the close protection officers, learning more about their families, their careers. He understood now, in a visceral way he hadn't before, the weight they carried so he and his family didn't have to. This wasn't a breach of protocol, but a human acknowledgement of a partnership forged under extreme duress. The legal process against David Rigby moved slowly but inexorably. The psychiatric assessments concluded he was fit to stand trial, though they painted a picture of a man suffering from a severe delusional disorder, exacerbated by social isolation and online radicalization. His defense would likely argue diminished responsibility. For Thorne, the prospect of testifying in court was a looming reality. He prepared by reviewing his statements, ensuring his recollection remained crystal clear. He thought often of Rigby's empty eyes on the pavement. The man was a weapon, yes, but one that had been assembled piece by failure, of community, of mental health support, of the algorithms that fed his despair. Thorne's job was law enforcement, not social commentary, but the distinction felt blurrier now. A few months after the incident, Thorne was assigned to a lower-profile duty, overseeing security for a refurbished children's wing at a London hospital that Catherine was opening. The event was tightly controlled, no public walkabout. As Catherine unveiled a plaque and chatted with young patients, Thorne maintained his watchful perimeter. At one point, a little boy in a wheelchair, excited by the princess's attention, tried to propel himself forward too quickly. Thorne instinctively stepped forward, a gentle, blocking motion with his arm, not touching the boy but creating a safe buffer. He smiled down at the child. "Steady there, mate." Catherine glanced over, caught the interaction, and gave Thorne a small, appreciative nod. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated protection. No threat, just a child's enthusiasm needing gentle guidance. It felt, for the first time since the spring, like a healing balm on his purpose. Later that week, he finally agreed to have a proper, informal drink with his welfare officer, Mike. In the quiet corner of a pub, away from the job, Mike didn't ask about the incident directly. He talked about his own close call years prior, the irrational guilt that followed, the dreams that faded but never quite disappeared. "You don't get over it," Mike said, swirling his pint. "You just make a different piece with it. It becomes part of your story, not the whole book." Thorne listened, and, for the first time, he felt the tight coil of tension in his shoulders begin to loosen, just a fraction. He was not alone in this aftermath. The profession he had chosen came with these shadows, and sharing their weight was allowed. He drove home that night, and, instead of sitting in the silent kitchen, he went upstairs and peeked into his daughter's rooms, watching them sleep, safe and sound. The fear was still there, but it was now edged with a fiercer, more profound gratitude. Time, the great leveler, did its work. The shocking palace scene became a dated news clipping, a footnote in royal histories titled The Chlorine Incident, or the London Hall Scare. Princess Charlotte grew taller, her confidence blooming under the careful, loving stewardship of her parents. Public appearances became routine again, though always with that invisible, reinforced layer of vigilance. She waved with a natural grace, her smile bright, the shadow of that day receding into the background of a busy, privileged childhood. For her, it would likely become a hazy, early memory, contextualized by her parents' love and the constant, silent presence of protection. Sergeant Mark Thorne received a formal commendation in a private ceremony at Buckingham Palace. He shook the hand of a senior commissioner, accepted the small medal, and felt a sense of closure. The official record now reflected his actions. He never spoke of it publicly, honoring the code of silence that defined his profession. He continued his career, eventually becoming an instructor, passing on the hard-earned lessons of that day to new recruits. He taught them procedure, vigilance, and the psychology of crowds. But he also, in his own way, taught them about the human cost, the weight of the gaze that must never waver, the the quiet toll it takes, and the profound, personal satisfaction that comes from enabling a normalcy for others that you yourself must constantly forego. The incident was a scar, but one that strengthened his resolve, making him not just a guardian of people, but a guardian of their peace. David Rigby was sentenced to a secure hospital order under the Mental Health Act. The court accepted he was operating under severe delusions. There would be no dramatic prison term, just confinement and treatment, possibly for life. He became a statistic, a case study in the dangers of online echo chambers and untreated mental illness. The system had failed to catch him on the way down, and could now only contain him at the bottom. For Thorne, learning the sentence brought a strange, hollow finality. There was no villain to hate, just a broken man to pity. It underscored the bleak truth that his job was often about managing the symptoms of a sick world, not curing its diseases. Years later, on a bright autumn day, Thorne was overseeing security for a major royal event, the Trooping the Color ceremony. He was in a command post now, monitoring feeds, coordinating teams. On the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the royal family appeared, a symbol of continuity and tradition. Among them stood a teenage Princess Charlotte, poised and smiling, sharing a joke with her brother. The crowds below cheered, a sea of Union Jacks and happy faces. Thorne watched her on the monitor, this young woman she had become, safe and shining in the sunlight. He thought of the little girl in the blue coat, of the desperate man in the gray jacket, of the split-second decision that had helped ensure this future moment of normalcy. He felt no surge of pride, just a deep, quiet sense of fulfillment. The line he walked was still razor-thin, and the threats evolved, but the purpose remained steadfast. He had not just stopped a threat. He had helped protect a story, the story of a family, of a childhood, of a nation's symbol, allowing it to continue past a moment of terrifying fracture. The memory of the shocking palace scene never left him, but it no longer defined him. It was a dark thread woven into the broader tapestry of a life spent in the shadows, so that others could stand, safely, in the light. He keyed his mic, his voice calm and clear as he coordinated the next phase of the operation, his eyes still watchful, forever on guard.